Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is lovely to see you, and welcome to the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow lecture. My name is Adrian Bowman. I'm a member of the Council of the Society, and I have the great pleasure of chairing this evening's proceedings. Now, we very commonly have guests at our lectures, and as you can see, we are full to overflowing tonight. So people come as guests because they're attracted by the topics, the individual speakers, and I'm sure that that will be the case this evening for many people. So some of you may be new to the building. Let me quickly deal with some practicalities. Toilets, should you need them, are in the basement, but there is an accessible toilet close to the main entrance. In the unlikely event we need to evacuate the building, just follow the exit signs at the front and at the rear. And finally, to avoid embarrassment, could you please make sure your mobile phone is off? Thank you. Last year, we saw major celebrations to mark the 300th anniversary of the birth of Adam Smith, who was a student, a scholar, and a rector in the University of Glasgow. His ideas and his writings on economics, politics, and society have had profound influence on future generations. Indeed, that influence is still felt today. So in recognition of that, this society began to hold a regular Adam Smith lecture, where an eminent expert in a relevant area is invited to speak. Eminent and expert are adjectives that apply without question to this evening's speaker, Professor Sir John Curtice. Those who introduce talks in any setting will often make the statement that this evening's speaker needs no introduction. One could certainly make that case for John, as in the run-up to any election, he's present in the living rooms of a large proportion of the population, as the go-to person when the television and other media need sound advice and insight into what's going on. On more than one occasion, I've had the clear impression that the interviewer has been rather stunned by the comprehensive and insightful analysis which flows from John when he's invited to comment. He clearly is an expert. So, although John may not need an introduction, he certainly deserves one. He is Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, where he's also a Senior Research Fellow in the Scottish Centre for Social Research and the UK in a Changing Europe. But perhaps his greatest accolade is to have been introduced by a prominent broadcaster. I heard this myself. I think it was on the Today programme, where he was described as a national treasure. I agree. So, John, we're really delighted you're able to be with us this evening, and it's a great pleasure that I invite you to speak on a fractured polity, British politics, after the 2024 election. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Of course, I think the point about national treasures is that they're meant to be museum pieces. And I'm not quite sure I'm quite willing to be there yet, but anyway. I must also, to be honest, I thought this hall would be about half full this evening. The West End is always a curious place. I'm now even more clear that it's curious that so many people will be willing to turn out at about -2 and freezing fog in order to listen to a lecture about politics. At least there are still some people in the country who evidently still think our political situation is worth discussing, even though perhaps, one of the things I will come to later on, many of our fellow citizens are somewhat disenchanted with the whole subject. So, you've seen the title. It's about in a sense, what should we read into the 2024 election and what perhaps might be the implications. But I'm going to start, as it were, by having no, it's not going to work, is it? Right. Right. So what I was about to do was to define what I mean by British politics as normal. So I'm talking about a fractured polity. I'm implying that something has changed from some previous set of expectations. And this would be my definition, as it were, of what, for much of the post-war period, we would regard as being the norm of post-war British politics. The first is that we have a system of alternating two-party majority government. We have a Conservative government for a while, and eventually we get tired of that, and so we have a Labour government. We get tired with that, and we have a Conservative government again. And in all instances, we have a situation where whoever is in government enjoys an overall majority. That is the norm. It's not been without its exceptions, but that has been the norm that we have got used to. And it's really particularly dependent on the fact that we've got votes and seats dominated by two parties, Conservative and Labour. Now that system of alternating government, what was it underpinned by? Well, it's underpinned by a demographic division that was essentially a division by social class. The Conservative Party, broadly speaking, was the party of middle-class people, who were more likely to vote for it than to vote for Labour. Whereas in contrast, Labour Party, of course, which was founded in 1900 in order to provide representation for working-class people, was associated with those who are involved in manual employment. And so it was about an articulation of the principal economic division in societies in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Allied with that was also an ideological debate between left and right. It's essentially a debate about equality and some of the inequalities that arise out of capitalism and the associated social class system. So if you're on the left, you say there's too much inequality in our society and that the government should be doing something about it. It should be trying to reduce the extent of economic differences. Whereas if you're on the right, you say, no. Actually, what the state should be doing is providing the incentives that will encourage entrepreneurs to invest. And as a result of that investment, the economy will grow. And as David Cameron once put it, out of the proceeds of growth, everybody can profit. And that's the best way of trying to help out those towards the bottom of the economic pile, as well as providing opportunities for those who are further towards the top. Helping to sustain this system of two parties divided between left and right, middle class and working class, is an electoral system, single-member plurality, or first past the post as it's more commonly known, which basically makes it difficult for third parties to win. The old joke is, once, in the 1950s and 1960s, is you could take the whole of the Liberal Party representation in the House of Commons, put them a taxi, send them to Brighton for a day, and nobody would notice that they weren't there, right? You could get them all in one taxi, and nobody would notice because there were only about a half a dozen at any one time inside the House of Commons. So that is the norm, which I am wondering whether or not has been fractured, and whether therefore the claim that we're now looking at a fractured polity is correct. Now, the first thing we can just do, just to kind of raise some question marks, is just to remind ourselves of the result. Because it is one of the most remarkable and unusual results in the whole of post-war British politics. I keep on now having to say to journalists, if you want to understand British politics, don't go to the House of Commons. It is the last place in which now to understand British politics. Because, of course, we have a government with a majority of 174, and a House of Commons that is dominated by that party, therefore. But actually, that party only got 35% of the vote. And once you take into account the fact that the turnout was on the low side, only around 20% of the registered electorate actually turned out and voted for the current government that has a majority of 174. But this was basically an election at which numerous records were broken. No previous majority government in UK electoral history has been elected with so low a share of the vote. let alone one with a majority of 174. The previous low was Tony Blair in 2005 when he got 36% of the vote in Great Britain. The Conservatives have never, ever done so badly before, all the way back to 1832 when they were founded and we had the first election that can in any sense be regarded as democratic. We had more third-party MPs and more Liberal Democrats, stroke Liberal MPs, at any election since 1923. We had more votes cast for parties other than Conservative, Labour or Liberal Democrat in our history. And Reform's share of the vote is the highest share of the vote for any fourth quote-unquote party, although of course Reform came third in terms of votes. We have more MPs elected other than under the label of Conservative, Labour or Liberal Democrat within England at any stage since 1918. And we actually have as many as 14 different parties inside the House of Commons who have at least one MP, and that is the highest number ever. You can see why I'm beginning to think that once you start looking at votes, and also in terms of aspects, even aspects of the representation of the House of Commons, leaving aside the majority of 174, we seem to be looking at a rather different polity and a more fractured polity than we were used to. Indeed, also putting some of these things together, the share of the vote for Conservative and Labour combined is the lowest at any stage since and including 1922, which was the first election which Labour effectively displaced the Liberal Party as the principal challengers to the Conservatives. Now, this isn't come completely out of the blue. People in my trade have been talking about, the decline of the two-party system ever since the 1960s. Their share of the vote's been gradually declining. Indeed, one esteemed election specialist, David Saunders, gave a lecture at the British Academy on the eve of the 2017 election, in which he laid out all the reasons as to why the two-party system was under threat. And then, lo and behold, as you can see with that peak just up there, the 2017 election reversed the trend, as indeed did 2019 to some degree. But we now seem to be back in trend. I've already said record number of third-party seats. Here is the graph that just goes to show the point. We now have 117 MPs elected other than for Conservative or Labour. We've never had as many as that since 1923. And also, for good measure, and it doesn't matter which index you use, it comes out the same. This is the most disproportional outcome ever. These are the figures since 1974, which is the first election at which the then Liberal Party fought most of the seats. Before that, we really did have a two-party system. Oh, by the way, one other thing that's often missed, 5 political parties fought virtually every constituency across Great Britain. We have never previously had 5 political parties all fighting across the whole of Great Britain. So in a whole variety of ways, therefore, we are looking at a system of political parties and levels of votes and party organisation that is very, very different. Still, there are some important questions to ask. I said that one of the crucial things about a system of two-party alternating government, and one of the supposed virtues, is that it enables people to hold the government to account. As I said at the beginning, we have the Conservatives in office, but when we come to the conclusion that this party is no longer doing a good job, we can replace it with another party. It will also then be a majority government. There are no arguments about who is responsible. If you have a coalition government, you can argue about whether or not it's Party A or Party B that was responsible for the great mess up that we think this government is responsible for. So who do you blame? it becomes more difficult to hold the government to account. With a system of single-party, alternating majority government, we know who to blame, and when we've decided that they're no good anymore, we can put somebody else in and throw them out and ensure that, therefore, we have this crucial discipline that politicians know that the electorate can throw them out and they won't be able to do anything about it. So we must ask ourselves, was the government held to account? Because certainly superficially, we can see that the one thing about the system that worked as we might expect is that one party with a majority was replaced with another government with a majority. And that may well indeed be a commentary on our view about the Conservative government by the time we got to last summer. But then let's look also underneath the bonnet a little bit. What's happened to those traditional underpinnings of left v right and social class being the principal demographic division? And then we have to ask ourselves, well, hang on, how did the electoral system allow so many third-party MPs into the House of Commons? It's not meant to do that. And indeed, how do we end up with, even by the standards of single-member plurality, not intended to be a proportional system, an outcome that was so heavily disproportional? And then, of course, the first three questions are the academic questions, and people in my trade will quite happily talk about, we'll have great fun writing about this for years, right? But the rest of the world are usually vaguely interested, well, hang on, does any of this matter? What are the possible implications? Or to put it slightly differently, where might we be going in the wake of the outcome of July 2024, and also some of the wider circumstances that surrounded that outcome? So that's what I will come to towards the end. Now, in a sense, you could say, this is the only slide I need all evening. Don't worry, there are a few more. But this is a running monthly average of the standing of the parties in the opinion polls throughout the whole of the last Parliament. Blue is Conservative, red is Labour, as you might expect. Reform are blue down at the bottom there, grey is Liberal Democrats, and the yellow one are the Greens. I couldn't quite get all the colours to match. It is now difficult to remember, but for the first 2 years of the last Parliament, the Conservatives were never, ever behind Labour consistently in the opinion polls. We got to even Stevens towards the end of 2020, and then Boris Johnson managed to get a vaccine in a few arms about COVID more rapidly than any other government, sold it brilliantly, and the Conservative lead re-emerged. May 2021, they won a by-election in Hartlepool from the opposition. But then we get towards the end of 2021. The initial problem was the attempt to rescue the parliamentary career of one Owen Paterson, who had been found by the Standards Committee of the House of Commons to have engaged in lobbying of ministers on behalf of organisations for whom he was taking money. This is against the rules of the House of Commons. But Boris Johnson wanted to be, Owen Paterson, good right-wing Tory MP, wanted to rescue his career. Tried to rescue it, got Tory MPs to vote against the disciplinary, the discipline that was going to be imposed on him, and then found he just couldn't sustain it and reversed. And support for the Conservatives went down a bit. And then literally about a couple of weeks later, we had the first stories that said that the interpretation of the COVID regulations at 10 Downing Street was rather more liberal than in virtually any other organisation in the whole country. And of course, this was an issue with incredible emotional resonance, because lots of people hadn't been able to hold the hands of their loved one dying from COVID in hospital, or hadn't been able to visit loved ones with dementia in a care home and they were clearly deteriorating as a result. Lots of people made very, very difficult sacrifices in support of lockdown. And that's the point at which the red line crosses the blue line. So the first word you need to know about to explain, understand why the Conservatives lost It's Partygate. You can probably guess the second word. It's Truss. All right, the Liz Truss fiscal event in the autumn of 2022, when she attempted to reduce taxes without funding them and saying it was a dash for growth, and the markets reacted adversely. That's the moment when Labour hits 50% in the opinion polls. The Conservatives end up at around about 24, which of course is what they ended up in by polling day. And that's essentially it. That is in those 2 6-week periods, the Conservatives' fate was sealed. And to that extent, at least, we can see that the public reacted against the government on 2 occasions when A, the integrity of the government, and then B, the competence of the government were called into question. The only thing you then need to know thereafter, it was a little bit, the Tories failed to vote for the Privileges Committee report that said that Boris Johnson had lied to the House. That saw their support begin to fall away again in the summer of 2023, and reform started to rise very much towards the end of the Parliament. Oh, by the way, just when the Conservatives kept banging on about immigration, not a good idea to bang on about what many people regard as a policy failure. So we can certainly see already a picture whereby the public perhaps thought they had good reason to hold the government to account, i.e. to vote against the incumbent government. But we can also take it a little bit further. This is data about 2019 Conservative voters just before the July election. And I'm dividing them up on the left-hand side according to that views about what was happening to the economy. So the very small blue bar on the left-hand side, these are the folk who thought the economy was getting a lot worse. Only 12% of 2019 Tory voters who held that view said they were going to vote Conservative again. The fourth histogram and in that first quartet are the people who thought the economy was getting better. 60% of them, all of them being 2019 Tory voters, said they would vote Conservative again. So you can see how the economy and people's perceptions of the economy, because for the most part, there were a lot more people who felt the economy was getting worse than felt it was getting better. The economy, this is now well after the Liz Truss fiscal event, the public were holding the Tories to account. That is, if you thought the economy wasn't doing well, you were much less willing to vote Conservative again. Where did you go? Well, some people went to Labour, but also notice that support for reform is also higher amongst 2019 Conservative voters who thought the economy was doing badly. The rise of reform isn't just simply to do with immigration. Actually, in my view, it's much less to do with immigration than it is to both do with the economy and the NHS. But we can come back into the Q&A on that if you want. But the crucial point here, voters are defecting from the Conservatives in accordance with their perception of the state of the economy. The second issue that voters were also defecting away from the Conservatives from was on the NHS. Levels of satisfaction with the NHS were at a record low prior to the 2024 election. Why? Because waiting times and waiting lists are at an all-time high. And we know that satisfaction with the health service is very heavily related to the speed with which people can get access to treatment when they need it. So again, I'm dividing 2019 Conservative voters in the same way. The blue bar on the far left-hand side are the folk who thought they voted Conservative in 2019, but they now thought the NHS was a lot worse. Only around a quarter of them were willing to vote Conservative again. Conversely, amongst that relatively small number of people who thought the NHS was getting better, 3/4 of them were willing to vote Conservative again. And yes, Labour are picking up more of these folk if they thought they were getting a lot worse, but so also are reform. These were the two issues. It wasn't immigration, by the way. It wasn't taxation. These were the two central issues on what it looks as though voters were holding the Conservatives to account. Basically, the economy was not doing well enough in their view, and public services were in too poor a state. Where did they go, however? Because under my classic model of politics is normal, voters should be going from Conservative to Labour. But I've already shown you quite a lot of them went to Reform. Indeed, they did. Most 2019 Tory voters who had given up on the party went to Reform. Nearly 1 in 4, these are all polls done just after the election of how people have voted. Around nearly 1 in 4 of those people who voted Conservative in 2019 voted Reform in 2024. Only around 1 in 8 voted Labour, and less than 1 in 10 switched to Liberal Democrats. So voters held the Conservatives to account, yes, but they did not necessarily do so by voting for the principal opposition party or even the classic party of protest, the Liberal Democrats. And to that extent, at least, the model does not fit. And indeed, it does therefore also mean that much of Labour's success in the election is founded not on voters switching to Labour, but on voters switching to Reform. I know that is a very difficult message for Labour activists to accept, but unless you understand it, you will not understand the position in which your party now finds itself. It's also the case, by the way, however, it wasn't just the Conservatives being held to account. So also were Labour. This again is a difficult and sensitive area, but one of the things that Keir Starmer talked about a great deal in trying to persuade people that the Labour Party has changed and that therefore it can be entrusted with government once more was the way in which he had tackled anti-Semitism. Fair enough. Trouble was that did, as a result of a rather unfortunate, from his point of view, interview on LBC relatively early after the 7th of October with the horrendous the horrendous Hamas attack on Israeli citizens, lead him to seemingly underplay, at least from the perspective of many people who identify as Muslim, with the damage that was being done, even at that stage, in Gaza. Labour lost ground very heavily in those constituencies, see the right-hand side, where 20% or more people identify as Muslim. Actually, the Labour vote falls as heavily in those constituencies as the Conservative vote did across the country as a whole. Who picks it up? Well, it's lots of independent voters. It's also the Workers' Party, that's George Galloway's party, and also the Greens as well. So it isn't just the Conservatives being held to account. The voters are holding the opposition to account. Not only in terms of the particular issue of Gaza, but also more broadly. Actually, it was a really bad time in July to have been in government. We all know, and I'll come to this in a moment, the SNP struggled north of the border. You can see that here. We know the Conservatives struggled, but Labour, who of course were responsible for the devolved government in Wales, and Plaid Cymru had just got out of the collaboration agreement with them just before the election, also suffered in Wales. Their vote went down by around 4 points. Oh, by the way, you can now see, once you take Scotland out of the arithmetic, Labour basically did not advance. It's 0.5 point in England and down 4 points in Wales. But what's going on? Well, yeah, and you can show very clearly, even if you look separately according to whether or not there were seats where the Conservatives were defending or seats that Labour were defending, Labour's performance in Wales, see the right-hand side, was consistently worse than its performance in England. See the blue bars. So Labour in Wales were also being held to account. The result in Scotland, of course, saw the SNP fall away very heavily, with which you're familiar. This was also the SNP being held to account. Again, this is the very similar analysis to what I showed you for the Tories. Okay, this is again dividing 2019 SNP voters according to their views about the state of the NHS. On the left, but I'm showing you this over time. But let's just first of all focus on the grey bars. So in May 2024, just before the election, amongst those 2019 SNP voters who felt that the NHS was either at least no worse, maybe even getting better, 62% of them were willing to vote SNP again. In contrast, amongst those who thought that the NHS was getting a lot worse, less than half were willing to vote SNP again. People's evaluations of the NHS were beginning to count against the SNP if they were adverse. What you should notice, however, if I were to go back 2 years previously when Nicola Sturgeon was still First Minister, that was largely not the case. One of the problems for the SNP has been that the insulation of the constitutional question, which basically meant that voters weren't concerned about how well they were being governed, that insulation finally wore thin in the post-Sturgeon era, and voters were now also voting for or against the SNP on the basis of their record in government. So this is an election at which the Conservatives were held to account, Labour were held to account, and the SNP were held to account. And to that extent, at least, this isn't just a classic British election in which voters held a central government at Westminster to account solely, and in so doing, voters switched to the principal opposition party. No, they switched to a party that hadn't previously much of a record in elections at all. All of which of this kind of suggests, and this is something just to hang on to, I'm going to come back to it later in the lecture, to the fact that maybe this was an election that the Conservatives lost rather than Labour won. And here's just one of many slides of people's evaluation of the Labour Party and of Keir Starmer before the election that helps to tell this story. This is whether people said they felt favourably or unfavourably about Labour, red line, Starmer, blue line. Two things to note. We basically never ever had a period in the whole of the last Parliament when more people regarded Labour favourably than unfavourably. The second thing to note is that certainly from the spring of 2021 onwards, which was the moment when Starmer had his wobble about whether or not he should remain as Labour leader in the wake of the poor results in May 2021, Starmer was always less popular than his party and therefore has never been a popular politician. Something I'm going to come back to later on. But these are just two of many examples of where pollster after pollster was saying there isn't much enthusiasm for Labour as an alternative. It's just that voters want to get rid of the incumbent government. And I will show you some of the patterns of voting behaviour in a moment that will underline that point further. Now, of course, one of the things that Keir Starmer was trying to do as party leader was to repair some of the damage that Labour felt had been done to it by the Brexit issue and the way in which, and particularly Labour's loss of support in so-called red wall seats, seats which in some cases have been Labour ever since 1935, often in areas of strong working class representation, ex-mining areas, etc., where Boris Johnson managed, and the Conservative Party managed to win in 2019 for the first time. And this was part of a broader story where, in fact, the evidence from 2019 was that working class people were no longer more likely to vote Labour. So one of Starmer's strategies, therefore, was don't talk about Brexit. Shh, say nothing. No, say nothing. Don't challenge the government on Brexit. Don't talk about what much your plans are, because we feel we have to get back the folk who are traditional Labour voters who voted for Brexit and voted for Boris Johnson. This is showing you the level of support for the various parties in 2024, according to whether they would vote to rejoin or stay out. So this is their current preference. And it also shows you the change as compared with the equivalent statistic for 2019. Now, there's one point to make straight away. You can see how the Conservative, that coalition that Boris Johnson assembled 5 years ago tomorrow, I was reminded today, it's actually the anniversary of Boris Johnson's victory, 5 years tomorrow, that he got 80% of Leave voters to vote for him. That coalition completely fractured. But it's not the Labour Party that did the fracturing. For the most part, it is Reform that did most of the fracturing. Most of the pro-Brexit vote that defected from the Tories went to Reform. Labour picked up a bit, but not a great deal, and their vote is still overwhelmingly, primarily a pro-EU vote. And to that extent, at least, it is not clear that Starmer's strategy had much impact. What is certainly true is that there is no evidence that Starmer's strategy had any success in bringing working class voters, in particular, back into Labour's ranks. Sure, the red wall seats are now Labour, but that's because they were marginal seats in the first place, and Labour has so many of the seats in the first place. Indeed, if anything, it is now even more clearly the case that Labour are stronger amongst AB, i.e. professional and managerial folk, than they are amongst DE, i.e. working class voters. Oh, by the way, the Conservative vote is also no longer determined by class. So this was something that had been happening gradually in the run-up to 2019. In 2019, no class division between Conservative and Labour. That is still the case. That traditional demographic division is still notable by its absence. Except, of course, which is now the most, relatively speaking, the most working class party in our society, it is Reform. Sorry again for those of you who find that uncomfortable. But for that, relatively speaking, in terms of its support, Reform is successful amongst working class voters. And Liberal Democrats are actually the most middle class group in our society. That's not much of a change. But you know, I was once giving a lecture in Durham University not so long ago, and I was taken into Durham Cathedral by the folk who were looking after me. And in there was a display, an exhibition of banners associated with the Durham Miners' Gala, which of course was a traditional working class Labour. You know, there were the banners of Keir Hardie, Tony Benn, etc., even Arthur Scargill, right, etc., etc. And I went, this is yesterday's world. This world has gone. The core Labour vote now is the young middle-class professional living in London. London is where Labour support is highest. Young middle-class professionals in London are the folk that make London so pro-Labour. This is a completely different world from the traditional world that we were once used to. What is our politics divided by? It's divided primarily by age. Older people still, relatively speaking, vote Conservative. Younger people, relatively speaking, still vote Labour, though you will note that the Greens ate seriously into Labour's vote amongst those aged 18 to 24. Most of them, of course, were first-time voters, but Labour's support amongst the first-time voters of 2024 is much lower than it was in 2019. Oh, and what's the other division in our society? It is education. University graduates who historically were not particularly pro-Labour because they're in middle-class jobs and middle-class people voted Conservative. Labour is particularly popular amongst those with degrees. The Conservative Party is relatively popular amongst those with little in the way of educational qualifications. This is the Brexit divide just being continued to be replicated in our pattern of party politics. So that traditional demographic division is not with us. What about that division between left and right? Now, I need to do a little bit of quick conceptual work here. I've already said the argument between left and right is an argument essentially about equality. But there's also arguably always been a little bit of another division in our society between what we might call social liberals and social conservatives. Social liberals are essentially people who say, look, what moral code you follow, it's your choice. What social mores you adhere to, your choice. What language you speak, your choice. And these also tend to be people who quite like living in a diverse society. For them, London is heaven on earth. Social conservatives, in contrast, say, no, hang on, look, a society, if it needs a certain amount of commonality to cohere, that therefore, as a result, society does have a right and a responsibility to impose a moral code on its citizens. At the moment, for example, it's illegal to assist somebody with a suicide, and this is a debate that's now going on about whether we should change that. And more broadly, these are also folk who say, well, you know, actually too much immigration, it undermines the culture, it means that, you know, culturally it's challenging, etc., etc. This is showing you the trend over the trend over time up to 2019. Historically, left-hand side, the differences in the level of support for both Labour and Conservative, according to whether people are socially liberal or socially conservative, were relatively small. The Conservatives tend to do a little bit better amongst social conservatives than amongst social liberals. Labour actually didn't really make much difference at all. But by the time we got to 2019, there was quite a notable division. Why? Because Brexit was a division between social liberals and social conservatives, not a division between left and right, and social liberals and Remainers and Leavers. Leavers were voting Conservative, Remainers were voting Labour and Liberal Democrat. Therefore, this division opens up in 2017 and 2019. So our politics begins to become two-dimensional, because the left-right division didn't disappear. This is again taking voters on the left and voters on the right. Labour do better amongst those on the left, Conservatives do better amongst those on the right. And that didn't really change. So what's happened to this now? Well, again, but to understand what's going on, actually, we should no longer just simply look at Conservative and Labour. We should look at all the parties, because this makes a difference. So this is, first of all, showing you the position in 2019 now with 5 parties. And you will see, again, so the Conservatives are doing better amongst those who are more authoritarian or socially conservative, Labour amongst those who are more socially liberal. The Liberal Democrats do better amongst the social liberals, that's the 17% grey bar. But you know, the Greens and the Brexit Party are too small at this stage to make much difference. Where are we in 2024? Well, first of all, notice that the left-right divide is still with us. Right? The Conservatives are doing better amongst those on the right. Labour are better amongst those on the left. The Greens, however, also do relatively well amongst those on the left. And Reform do rather better amongst those on the right. So the left-right division is there now also in the smaller parties. But look at also the social liberal, social conservative or libertarian authoritarian division. Yep, Conservatives are still, they're not as divided on this dimension. Labour almost as divided on this dimension. But notice how the Liberal Democrats continue to be divided on that dimension. The Greens are as divided on this dimension as they are in the left-right dimension. And Reform, above all, are a party appealing to social conservatives, which means that actually, and I haven't got the slide here, but if you put this together, actually, when you took all 5 parties, the division between social liberals and social conservatives in terms of how they vote is just as big as the division between left and right. So we've still got two-dimensional politics in terms of our values, not one-dimensional. Okay, now how did we end up with the result that we did in terms of the result being so disproportional? In particular, how did we end up with Labour winning so big a majority? Because you probably heard people like me occasionally coming up on the telly and the radio or whatever, say, oh, it's really difficult for Labour Party to win the election. They've got to get they might have to get a majority of 13, a lead of around 13 points in order to get a majority of 1. That's what this slide shows. See the penultimate line. That was assuming no change in SNP support, no change in the other party's support, and that all that was happening was that Labour's vote was going down, going up by the same amount everywhere, by about 13 points, and the Conservative vote going down by the same amount everywhere, by about 13 points, and that there was no change in the geographical distribution of Conservative and Labour support. Indeed, if we actually take the outcome of the 2024 election in terms of votes and say, well, what would the outcome in seats have been if the ups and downs in party support have been the same everywhere, either the same across the whole of Great Britain, or if you take the middle column, the same everywhere within England and within Scotland and within Wales. What you will notice straight away is if that is what had happened, Labour would not have won an overall majority. Maybe only just failed, but they wouldn't have got 326. The Conservatives would have had twice as many seats as they actually got, and the Democrats would have only got half as many seats as they actually got. Clearly something changed. And the point is the geography of Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat support fundamentally changed at this election in a way that meant that the relationship between seats and votes was transformed. And it's not complicated. This is the size of the fall in the Conservative vote, separately according to what share of the vote the Conservatives had in 2019. So on the left-hand side are those constituencies where the Conservative Party got less than 25% of the vote back in 2019. On average, their vote fell by just under 10 percentage points in such constituencies. On the right-hand side are those those constituencies where the Conservatives got more than 60% of the vote in 2019. On average, in those constituencies, their vote fell by 30 points. Now, you don't have to be a clever sophologist to work out what this means. If you are losing votes more heavily in places where you were previously strongest, you are going to lose more seats than would otherwise be the case. What was going on here, essentially what was going on is that the Reform vote was eating more heavily into Conservative support in constituencies on the right-hand side of this graph, not least, of course, because the Brexit Party, Nigel Farage's previous party, did not fight Conservative-held seats in 2019. So everything that Reform got was a gain from zero, and that did the Conservatives serious damage. But the second thing that changed, and this game brings us back to the fact that people were voting against the government rather than necessarily for anybody else, is to compare what happened according to who was first and who was second in a constituency back in 2019. So let's just first of all take the first 5 bars labelled Conservative Labour. So these are constituencies where the Conservatives were first in 2019 and Labour was second. You'll notice the Conservative vote's falling really heavily, more than anywhere else. And you will notice that apart from Scotland, Labour's vote is going up more here than anywhere else. Then look at the next quintet of histograms. Conservative first, Liberal Democrats second. Conservative vote again down heavily, though not quite so much. What's happened to Labour? It's a big fat zero. They're gaining nothing. Oh, the Liberal Democrats have suddenly appeared, because you can now see the Liberal Democrat vote is up by 9 points. Voters were voting tactically against the incumbent Conservative, and they were willing to vote for whichever of Labour or the Liberal Democrats were better able to defeat the Conservatives. You can then see with the next quintet, Labour's vote falling in general in seats they were trying to defend. So they're making, they didn't lose too many seats as a result of that. They just gained where they needed to gain. You can see the gains in Scotland, but basically, therefore, the electorate were voting strongly against the government, and they didn't some of them at least didn't care who they were voting for in order to achieve that objective. The SNP, by the way, north of the border, also seemed to lose out some of this. In particular, it looks as though voters worked out that although the Conservatives might have been second in the constituency back in 2019, actually voting Labour made more sense if you wanted to vote against the SNP, and Labour's vote actually increased most in places where they were starting off from third place. But this pattern again also meant that the SNP lost about twice as many, got 9 seats instead of about the 18 that they might otherwise have got. The result of all of this rise in support for third parties and this very variegated pattern of movement means that, again, for the first time in our electoral history, seats where Conservatives and Labour share first and second place are now represent less than half of all the constituencies in Great Britain. That's the 306. The second most common type of competition is Labour and Reform sharing first and second place, which are mostly places that Labour won. All right? And then it's Conservative Liberal Democrat contest. But just notice the widespread. So local politics in Britain is no longer dominated by the two traditional parties of British politics. So we're looking at an election where people voted against the government rather than for the opposition, that they fractured in terms of how they cast their votes. It resulted in the highest levels of third-party representation we've ever had before. What might all of this mean? Well, this is which takes us to the context in order to understand the possible implications. The first thing to say, this will not surprise you, I can probably account for most people in this room, we are economically deeply pessimistic. This is data from Ipsos throughout the whole of the last Parliament, asking people, do they think the economy is going to get better or going to get worse over the next 12 months? The only point during the last Parliament when more people thought amongst the general public that the economy was getting better than getting worse was in the middle of 2021 when we thought we were emerging out of lockdown over COVID, and indeed we were emerging out of the first lockdown over COVID. We then had the Omicron scare later in the year. But apart from then, we were always pessimistic. There is no previous Parliament during which the public had been as consistently and deeply pessimistic about the state of the economy ever since Ipsos started collecting this data in the 1970s. So we are a deeply, deeply economically challenged society. The second thing I've already mentioned, we have public services that we think do not work. We've seen how the Conservatives were punished for this. But this is satisfaction with the NHS all the way back to 1983. The blue line are those people who are satisfied. The red line are those who are dissatisfied. You can see the record level of dissatisfaction that I referred to earlier. However, and this is something that neither Conservative nor Labour have necessarily quite caught up with, which is that, of course, the other thing that happened in the last Parliament is that we had a record expansion in the size of the state. We are heading for record levels of taxation. We have had record levels of public spending, largely a consequence of COVID, though it's not just to do with COVID. This is data, again, going back to 1983, showing you what the public have said when they were asked, if the government has to choose, what do you think it should do? Should it increase taxes and spending on things like health and education? Should it keep them as they are, or should it reduce them? The bottom line is reduce. Not many people ever say that. The action is whether or not people say keep things as they are, or whether they say increase. Notice what happened towards under the new Labour government of 1997 to 2001. took Labour Party a while to actually realise that the public were more concerned at that stage about public services than they were about taxation. But eventually, they increased public spending, NHS waiting lists went down, schools got improved, and the public said, brilliant, well done, guys. And could you now please stop increasing our taxes? And by the time we got to the end of the last Labour government, only 31% of people were in favour of further increases in taxes. But before the public react against the expansion of the state. But then, of course, we had the Cameron-Osborne era of so-called austerity. And after a while, we got tired of that. And before the pandemic, we were beginning to say, hang on, our public services aren't so good. Maybe you should be taxing us a bit more. The fascinating thing about the right-hand side of this diagram is that there is very little evidence that despite the expansion of the state and the rise in taxation, that as a society that we have reacted against this. The politicians think we have, but the survey data does not substantiate that premise. There are various possible interpretations, but one interpretation, just to go away and think about, is that the pandemic was like war. The Second World War was the last time we dramatically increased the size of the state. The way the state rescued the labour market, and these days, by the way, also underpins the banking system, may well mean that our appetite for a larger state has grown. And at least until the National Health Service is improved, things are not going to improve. By the way, anyway, even though the Labour Party were also keen to say we're not going to increase taxes, most of the people who were in favour of increasing taxes were inclined to vote Labour anyway. You can try and persuade people that you've changed your colours, but it can be rather difficult. The other issue that faces us now, however, is low levels of trust and confidence in politics. This is a series that goes all the way back to the 1970s. Do you think the system of governing Britain doesn't need much improvement? That's the blue line. Or it needs a great deal of improvement? That's the red line. Elections always improve our view of ourselves, and that far right-hand reading is a post-2024 election reading. But if you can still see the gradual increase over time in the proportion of people who think that we need, the system of governing needs a great deal of improvement. It's the highest, the 69% that say that now is the highest after any election. And also, by the way, the proportion of people who say that they trust governments to put the interests of the nation before those of their party is also at its lowest in any reading taken immediately after an election. So, we have a government with a rather thin electoral base. It's there because people didn't want the other lot, but they didn't particularly vote for them, and they voted for lots of other people as well. But has also is faced with a very, very substantial public policy challenge, which is to get economic growth, to restore the public services, while operating with a very tight fiscal framework, partly imposed on themselves, but also imposed by the markets, because we've basically maxed out the country's credit card with the financial markets. And to do all of that at a time when we are less confident about how we're being governed than at any point in recent history. That is a very, very difficult challenge. And it is one that so far it is struggling to deal with politically. This is the net favourability of the Labour Party in Starmer. Starmer did become popular for a matter of weeks immediately after the election, and it's all disappeared again. But the crucial point to understand, he never was popular. He doesn't have a wellstring of popularity to ride on. Labour were never popular, and equally, therefore, that weakness now gets exposed given the difficult circumstances under which they're trying to govern. The Conservative Party, well, it's a little bit less unpopular now than it was at the time of the election, but only just. Whoops. Which does therefore mean, unsurprisingly, that when we look at the position of the parties in the current opinion polls, It is reform that have advanced more than anybody else, and that the Labour Party is already down to 27%, only just over half of the people who express a view, so they're going to vote Conservative or Labour. Now, none of this is a forecast, but I think what we need to appreciate is that the public now have more choice politically than they've ever had before, because we've got those 5 political parties, all of which seem capable of winning votes amongst various sections of the electorate. We have a government which, despite its overall majority, has a very substantial task in front of it, which it may well struggle to achieve. And so, yes, the system worked in a sense that the Conservatives were held to account, but that's really all that worked. And the question that now faces us, to which we do not know the answer, is if in the end Labour don't succeed in persuading the public that in fact they have started to turn things around, and if the Conservative Party have not managed to persuade people that perhaps they can be trusted once more with the reins of government, where will voters go? And the fracturing of 2024 may be followed by further fracturing in 2028 or 2029. Certainly, given both the challenge facing our politicians and where we have ended up electorally in the wake of last July, that prospect, it's not bound to happen, but it is a possibility that perhaps all of you as citizens may want to bear in mind as you think about the future of this country during the course of the next 5 years or so.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that fascinating description of the current state of affairs. Clearly, we live in interesting times. We're now going to have some discussion, some questions, and I'm sure this will be a lively session. The microphone runners have got their equipment, and I'll try to line people up if you indicate that you have a question to ask. Please, could I ask you to do 2 things? One is to hold the microphone so that it's pointing at your mouth. We can then hear you clearly. And the other is to please make your questions succinct so that we can get as many as possible in the time that remains. So please, let's have the first question. There's one here, and another question here later. Okay.
Thanks. I think the other thing that is the number of people who don't vote. I mean, in this city, for instance, more than 50% of people do not vote. And the question really is, can you say something about those people and the tendency for the actual turnout in elections to fall? Thanks.
Yeah, one of the reasons we're not talking about turnout is that we don't really as yet have the evidence that we need to talk about it. All the survey work that's available so far is work that's been done primarily via the internet. Now, it's great for many things, but it's not very good at getting at people who don't vote. The big academic project called the British Election Study is currently in the midst of doing a face-to-face random probability survey, which means people who are chosen at random to be interviewed by interviewers in their own home. This has got very expensive these days. It's got more challenging, fewer people are willing to do it, but that will have a better chance of getting at the folk who did not vote, and therefore giving us a data with which to analyse why people didn't vote. I mean, that said, I will give you I expected a low turnout, and the essential reasons why I expected low turnout were, 1, the polls were saying it's all over by the shouting. 2, there wasn't much difference between the 2 principal parties, and that replicated the situation of 2001, to which you could then add 3, we don't trust the bastards, and 4, apart from Nigel Farage, none of the politicians had any charisma or popularity or impact. I mean, it just happens to be true. You know, Rishi Sunak was not a very good politician. Keir Starmer is not a very good politician. Ed Davey is not a very good politician. Above all, what none of them can do, and you can now see this really dogging Keir Starmer, they cannot do the vision thing. They cannot lay out a broad synoptic message about where they're wanting to try to take this country. You know, Keir Starmer's got some milestones. I thought milestones told you when you were halfway on a journey and how much further you had to go, rather than an end destination. You need an end destination. The point about Farage, I mean, whatever you think about Farage, Farage can articulate the concerns that people have in a way that none of the other politicians are able to do. So, you know, in the absence of politicians who can do the vision thing, you know, we've got a public who say, well, what's the point? We know what's going to happen. It's not going to make much difference. And I don't have any enthusiasm for any of them. Bingo. Stay at home.
The idea that the public think by paying more taxes they will get better public services. Why do they feel that?
I'm tempted to say hope springs eternal. I mean, I think the real point to take away is that at the end of the day, what matters more to people, how much they're being taxed, or whether or not, if they fall ill, they have confidence that they will be looked after in a timely manner. And it looks as though the latter is the more pressing issue in our society. No, I mean, you know, to be honest, it may well be the case if and when the NHS is turned around. And there are all sorts of long-term challenges facing NHS, not least the ageing society. But that, if it is turned around at some point, then we will find out whether or not the public will tolerate a bigger state or not. But I know it is just, for the time being, it's just worth bearing in mind that, you know, despite the expansion of the state, the public have not operated in the reverse direction, and it at least leaves open the question as to where we're at. Well, you know, we will continue to, you know, whatever at the end of the day proves to be whatever we regard, as it were, the sweet spot of the correct levels of taxation and spending. That even if they are somewhat higher than they have been for much of the post-war period, we'll still have a debate about whether it should go up or go down or not. So there will still be an argument about whether or not we're getting value for money and all the rest of it.
The lady here, 4 rows back, and we must have some questions at the back. Yes, lady in red there.
There's also a gentleman right at the back as well who's been...
Hi, Professor Curtice. An amazing, very scary, I have to say, speech. Now, I wonder, nobody could doubt that the first few months of the current government have been difficult. They had quite a lot to pick up on.
Yeah.
They are out of government for 14 years, so they're not exactly expert at it. But how much of the deterioration, certainly the few things about winter fuel allowance didn't help, but how much of the disgust and the concern and the deterioration in the popularity is to do with a very hostile right-wing press who are on their back? If everything that they do would appear to be wrong. I don't want a populist like Nigel Farage. I can't even listen to him. But if that's the way we're going, I mean, is that not a tragedy?
Okay, no, it's a perfectly fair question. So I think, I mean, I could certainly make germs of truth for the case, but I will also say at the same time, but the Labour Party gave them the opportunity. So the one area where clearly the right-wing press got quite early onto this government is that, you know, Keir Starmer said, you know, we are going to be trustworthy, we are going to be clean, etc., etc. This is a promise that no politician should ever make. Tony Blair made it in 1997. We're going to be whiter than white. And then when there was some debate about his relationship with the then owner of Formula One. He had to go on the telly and say, look, read my lips, I'm an honest chap, right? Rishi Sunak made the same mistake when he became Prime Minister. He said, I'm going to lead a government of integrity. And then we discovered that his Chancellor had a somewhat dubious relationship, a non-relationship with HMRC. And the point, therefore, was that it gave when Starmer did that, it immediately gave the press the opportunity to start to dig into. And the first story was the fact that Lord Ali allegedly had a pass to 10 Downing Street. Why did Lord Ali have a pass to 10 Downing Street? He's not a politician, he's not a civil servant, right? And then from that we got into the story, well, actually Lord Ali's been rather generous with his clothing allowance to secure Starmer. And so sure, but the point is Starmer gave them the opportunity, and then also Starmer also revealed his weakness, because Starmer's response was, it was within the rules. That's a lawyer's answer. The problem is that it was very easy to persuade the public that the rules were wrong, and that a government that was being honest and straightforward with people would not have a curious way of funding somebody's clothing, right? So you've got to understand that it's the weaknesses of Labour and of Starmer in particular that have opened up the opportunity for, in that example, for the right wing for the right wing press. But I would say more broadly, the fact that Starmer was not popular, was not very good at doing the vision thing, that Labour were arguably too focused on winning the election, and not focused enough on working out what messages they should have that might make it easier for them to campaign after, to govern after the election. A lot of us were saying this before the beginning of July, right? So we're not surprised. But if you just think about it, right? You agree to a national insurance cut by the previous government. You back it, even though the OBR report at the time said this is unfunded. It was no more funded than was any of Liz Truss's tax cuts. And you also, if you knew your OBR, OBR were just constantly saying, and certainly where the Institute of Fiscal Studies were saying, that it is going to be impossible for the next government to run at the levels of public expenditure that the Conservatives are saying they're projecting within the existing tax envelope. And lo and behold, therefore, what happens? Well, basically, you reverse the national insurance cut, but of course you have to do it on employers rather than employees because of the promises you have made, rather rash promises, arguably, which is a mad way of making public policy, and is now discovering has all sorts of unintended consequences, like e.g. the impact on the charitable sector. Oh, and by the way, anybody and everybody who is providing services to the government is now going to charge them more because they need to reclaim what in some cases is a very substantial rise in their national insurance bill. Right? So again, I would suggest to you that you can see the seeds of the weakness and the attack on the government in terms of what was happening before the election. It ain't just the right-wing press.
The question at the back, and then the lady in red, and then the lady here by the pillar.
Hi there. I had a question for you about...
Sorry, can you put your hand up? I can't see where you are. Oh, right. Hi, yeah, fine. Thank you.
Got a question about French politics just now. Do you see the France being replicated here in the UK come the next election?
Oh, do I see France being replicated? Well, I mean, 2 points to make in response to that. One is that the UK is now relatively unique in terms of, mature West European democracy. So the countries that were not within the ambit of Russia before the fall of the Berlin Wall, virtually everywhere has seen marked changes in their party political structure during the course of the last 10 or 15 years. We have, the far right actually running Italy. We've seen the rise of the right in the Netherlands. We've seen the rise of Sinn Féin in Ireland. Now, in some cases, these parties are still being kept out of government. I mean, Macron himself is a completely new political phenomenon that he invented and a party behind it. So we've seen fundamental changes. So even our election in July looks tame by the standards of some of the changes of elsewhere. But equally, we should be aware that change can still happen. And of course, those of us who live north of the border know that the two-party system has no guaranteed right to life because it was destroyed up here back in 2015. All right? Now, of course, what is true, and I mean, the one thing that now makes life difficult in France is that under the rules of the Fifth Republic, if the president dissolves the parliament, they can't do it for another 12 months. We don't have that rule here. Indeed, we don't have any kind of fixed term parliament. So we could never get into the situation where you cannot form a government out of the parliament. If we can't form a government out of the parliament, no matter how long ago the previous election was, we can always go back to the electorate. So you cannot get that situation. But yeah, sure, could government come to formation get more difficult? Yes. We may find forming a government in Scotland in May quite difficult if Reform do indeed manage to get a significant breakthrough into the Scottish Parliament. Because at the moment, at least, there's a serious prospect that it will be impossible for either for the Nationalists and the Greens to control Holyrood, or for Conservative and Labour and Liberal Democrat together, when that's a pretty big stretch to control Parliament. I.e., the only way you can form a stable government will be one that crosses the nationalist-unionist divide. Look forward to Scottish politics being even more complicated.
The lady in red, and then the lady by the pillar. Tony? Lady.
It's a very simple question, really. How important a variable is the popularity of a political party to the outcome of an election?
Pretty important. I mean, at the end of the day, politics is a game about relatives, right? So, of course, it could be the case, indeed, this largely was the case in 2024, that none of the parties were particularly popular. But then it's the question of relative unpopularity. And sure, for all that one says about Labour's weakness, it wasn't anything like as unpopular as the Conservatives were. Ergo, therefore, they're in a position to be able to win election. And Keir Starmer certainly didn't come with the kind of baggage that Jeremy Corbyn had, particularly in 2019. Though I think one of the ironies about Jeremy Corbyn is that in some ways his greatest weakness was that he was the last moderate standing. He was the last moderate on Brexit. He was the only politician who was reluctant to declare himself as either a Remainer or a Leaver, and there was no ground for sitting in the middle at that place. That's one of the ironies of Corbyn. He was an extremist who arguably ended up losing because he was a moderate, but that's another complicated story. So the truth is that in the end, popularity of the parties matters. I mean, I'm more broadly, I mean, the point about the leaders is the reason why leaders matters is that most of us learn about what parties stand for, what they believe, what they're going to do via what leaders say. And that therefore, leaders, it's not that the popularity of leaders necessarily matters more than the popularity of the parties. It is that the leaders are the principal mechanism through which parties gain or fail to gain popularity.
Lady by the pillar. I should point out, by the way, one of the consequences of listening to John speak is that time stands still. I point out that the clock has stopped. We will be finishing by 9.
Our polity is fractured already. There is the evidence.
The lady here needs a microphone. Where's the microphone, please?
There we go. No, we have to remember that people are following this on Zoom, so there's nothing worse than trying to listen to something over Zoom and you can't hear what's being said.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Your last question at the end of your speech was where will the voters go in 2028
Yeah.
if the large parties have failed? But we've got an election here in Scotland in 2026.
Yep.
And the polls have very recently been quite interesting. And
Yep.
I believe at the beginning of this week, a poll came out which shows a trend, if it could be called that, for the SNP to regain its popularity. What is your thoughts on
Can
that?
I reverse that? There is clear evidence of a decline in Labour's popularity. There is less evidence of an increase in the popularity of the SNP.
Is that that's your answer to?
But the point is that, again, it comes back to saying politics is about relativities, all right? So if the SNP gain a little bit and Labour fall back, I mean, the fascinating thing about the poll at the weekend is that Labour's popularity is back north of the border, if this poll is correct, and we'll need more to confirm it, back to a level not seen since before Partygate. And you will now, all of you know why Partygate matters as a reference point, all right? So all the gain, all of that Scottish Labour revival that occurred in the wake of Partygate and Liz Truss seemingly gone. Now we'll wait and see. But the point is that, again, north of the border, Labour's message, and there's survey evidence to show it was very effective. You dislike the Conservative government, vote Labour. You're unhappy with the SNP, vote Labour. Send a message to them both. But if that is the principal way in which you acquire votes, and then you win the election, so therefore you're one of the parties that is now responsible for one of the governments, maybe don't be surprised that your support begins to fall away. I mean, in any case, the honest truth is the worst thing that happened to Anna Sarwar this year is Keir Starmer winning the election. It was bound to make it more difficult for Labour to win in May 2026, because it will come in, even without the particular weaknesses of the current Labour government. Governments in mid-term usually struggle. But, of course, the counterpoint to that is that voters may still be pretty unhappy about how the SNP is running the country, which could mean that Scotland fractures. And, that's part of what I was behind my answer earlier. I mean, Reform are not as popular here as they are south of the border, but they're still getting between about 12 and 15% of preferences for the regional list vote. And that's more than enough for them to get, a dozen MSPs or more.
We have time for a couple of quick questions. There's at least one at the back, I think two at the back, actually. Just a moment, sir, there's one at the back. We've been waiting for a little while.
Sir John, a double-edged question, really. First of all, is it your opinion that devolution will only work when we have parties of the same colour at both Westminster and Holyrood? And secondly, I'm sure you don't have a crystal ball, but can you tell us who you think might be the next Prime Minister before or after the next general election, please? Thank you.
I'll give you a quick answer. The answer to your first question is no. The point about devolution is not to have a situation where we have a love-in between Edinburgh and Holyrood. That, I think, is a fundamental mistake that the Scottish Labour Party made between 1999 and 2007. The point about devolution is that you've got somebody in Edinburgh standing up for Scotland and defending its interests within the framework of the Union vis-à-vis London. That is something that the Welsh Labour Party understands. It was something that Boris Johnson understood as Mayor of London. So it does. At the end of the day, even if you are of the same party as in London, yes, sure, you might hope you've got better back channels. But at the end of the day, if there is a dispute between you and London about what you think is in Scotland's interests, you have to defend Scotland's interests, because that's the electorate you have to serve. On your second question, well, what I will say to you is that, Keir Starmer is 61, so he will clearly have to ask himself whether he wants to carry on beyond the age of 66 if the election is in 2029. Who knows what the answer is? I think at the moment it is looking as though if there were to be a vacancy tomorrow, it would be a contest between Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting. That's probably more of an answer than you expected to get out of me, but anyway.
One question at the back, gentleman at the front, and then I think we're going to have to draw the circle.
Sure.
Hello, my question is, so obviously as the way the statistics and all that are going, obviously you can see that obviously just both Labour and Conservative have obviously been declining for obviously a long time. My point to you would be, obviously that leads to things obviously in England and the UK in general with things like reform. If there would be more people in terms of more candidates saying we can do both Labour and Conservative fields, turn to us, as well as reform like other people, is it just a Nigel Farage thing, or do you think more?
Sure, okay, I get your point. No, absolutely. No, I think the point is it isn't necessary. I mean, we've got the Liberal Democrats and the Greens and Reform, and in Wales and Scotland, the respective nationalist parties, all of whom might hope to be able to profit, if that's the right word, from whatever misfortunes hit the Labour Party. And there is no guarantee as to which of them will succeed. They all have strengths and weaknesses. The Greens at the moment are primarily mining a relatively niche market of largely young social liberal professionals, but they may be able to expand on it. The Liberal Democrats, of course, are historically a classic party of protest. However, their problem is they've only got 6 constituencies where they start off second to Labour. And I think, you know, they've got to work out how they've got to reposition themselves from what their position before 2024, which was to focus entirely on the Conservative Party and on the blue wall. And they've got to work out how to reposition themselves to be able to attack a Labour government when it's in trouble and to persuade voters to come to them. The challenge to Reform is it's no good banging on about immigration and about Brexit to win over Labour voters, because most Labour voters are not particularly concerned about immigration, and as I've shown you, most of them are in favour of the EU. What Farage has to do is to focus on the economic discontent that may still be continuing, and to suggest to voters that Reform have an answer to that. So they've also got to pivot. So none of them are guaranteed to succeed. All of them have impediments. All of them will have to change their strategy to some degree. But that's the art of politics. It's the ability of politicians to respond to changing circumstances and to craft a message that manages to illuminate voters' minds. So you know, so as well. So you can. I've talked about the weaknesses for Labour and Conservative. The smaller parties have their own weaknesses as well.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to draw to a close with great apologies to the gentleman at the front who I lined up, but we've reached 9 o'clock and we have a duty.
You can come and ask me afterwards.
Yes, indeed. So I want to say thank you very much indeed to John. He has demonstrated he is a national treasure. And however, hold your applause for just a second, because there's an important role for our president to play.
Hello everybody, my name's Pat Monaghan. I'm the president of the Society. I remembered to wear my chain of office tonight, it being Christmas, and I wanted to look glittery. First of all, when I first asked John to give this lecture, we chose this date because we thought it would be very close to when the election had just happened. Yes, so we got that wrong, but we didn't get much else wrong, I think, because we've had a wonderful lecture this evening. This is our Adam Smith lecturer, who of course was in a way the founder of political economy, and John has told us that the economy really matters. He's also shown us how much he really loves bar charts, but also that we now no longer have a two-party system. He didn't tell us whether he thought that was a good or a bad thing, and that's for us to ponder on. I've often wondered when watching John tell us about, you know, swingometers or whatever it is, what he really thinks, because he always manages to present what seems to be a fairly impartial view. He did that again tonight, but it slipped slightly in the questions, especially.
What did I give away?
Well, you gave away that you thought none of them had any charisma. However, I'm sure you'll agree with me that John himself has a lot of charisma. And so I'm going to present John, if I can get the box open, with the Society's Adam Smith Medal, and also, it's really hard to open this box, so I won't try, the Society paperweight. So please join me in thanking him.
My wife will tell you I'm hopeless at opening things. What I do in this situation is I kind of just hand it over. But anyway, I'm sure I'll manage it by the time I get home.
So thank you very much. The next lecture is on the 8th of January, and it's going to be about what future fossils might reveal.